They read his obituary at the funeral, tears, prayers, final goodbyes. But as the last hymn faded, the doors creaked open, and the man they buried stepped into the room, dripping with rain and very much alive. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The smoke had barely cleared when the news swept through Bryer County like a brush fire. Michael Reed was dead, they said, gone in a blaze that left nothing but twisted steel and scorched earth. The sheriff's department made a quick ruling. Accident. The coroner, faced with the charred remains and a scorched wallet containing Michael's ID, signed the death certificate with barely a second glance. No one questioned it. Not the town, not his friends, not even Sharon. Michael watched it unfold from the margins of his own life, a ghost tethered to a world that had already begun to forget him. He stood outside the diner as they stapled a paper obituary to the community board, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a borrowed jacket, the hood drawn low over his face. Loving husband, loyal provider, quiet man. Words as brittle as old newspaper. Michael tore the notice from the board and crumpled it in his fist. The ink bled against his damp skin as the rain fell, slow and cold. It wasn't grief that hollowed him out as he read those words. It was something worse, the sharp, bitter sting of a truth half told. He had taken the bus back into town that night, the same night the truck he had lent out in a favor of blind trust, went up in flames on the mountain road. He had returned to a house dark and cold, the porch light off, the front door locked. He hadn't knocked. Something deeper than instinct had told him not to. Instead, he had disappeared into the edges of the town, unseen, waiting, watching. Days passed, and the morning he expected to find never materialized. Sharon wore black, yes, but it was crisp, tailored, almost celebratory in its precision. When he followed her to the insurance office, he saw the truth plain as day. No trembling hands, no choked sobs, no tear-stained cheeks, only a signature penned in sure, even strokes. Only a check passed across the desk with clinical efficiency. The agent, Daniel Bryce, offered her a smile too long, too smooth, and she returned it. Not with grief, with expectation. Michael stood across the street, hands trembling not from cold, but from fury so deep it blurred the edges of his vision. His heart, long dulled by the slow grind of routine, now beat with a jagged, vicious clarity. They hadn't just buried him. They had erased him and written a new life over the grave he didn't know he was digging. And as Michael Reed watched Sharon slip the check into her handbag and glide from the office like a woman finally free, he understood one thing with perfect, shattering clarity. He had to decide if he was going to stay dead or if he was going to bury them instead. The rain came down in thin, bitter needles, drumming against the rusted gutters and soaking the uneven gravel outside the chapel. Michael Reed stood motionless beneath the sagging awning, water running in cold rivulets down the back of his neck, the brim of his cap dripping a steady rhythm onto the cracked concrete at his feet. His jacket clung to him, heavy and sodden, but he didn't move. He barely breathed. His gaze was pinned to the small stained glass window above the chapel doors, where blurred figures shifted and spoke and mourned a man who was not yet dead. The smell of damp wood and old hymnals drifted out each time the door cracked open. Inside, the pews were sparsely filled, familiar faces blurred by time and distance, old co-workers from the mill, men who had shared beer and hard laughter but hadn't known him past payday. A cousin from Arkansas he hadn't seen since they were boys, shifting uncomfortably in a too-tight suit. A handful of churchgoers murmuring polite regrets under their breath. None of them knew the truth. None of them even questioned it. Michael tightened his jaw as he caught sight of Sharon stepping up to the front, a vision of perfect composure in a fitted black dress and pearls that caught the overhead light. Her blonde hair was pinned into an elegant twist, and she clutched a tissue in one hand, more for effect than necessity. The pastor stepped aside, and the room fell into a hush as Sharon cleared her throat. Her voice was soft, reverent, a widow's practiced sorrow, but each word drove into Michael like a blade. "He was simple," Sharon said, the corners of her mouth curving almost imperceptibly. "Hard-working, but we grew apart. He wasn't the man I once loved." There was no catch in her voice, no crack of real grief, just the precision of a surgeon dismantling a corpse. "Maybe now he's at peace," she added, her voice dipping low, almost tender. "And so are we." We. Michael's fingers curled into fists inside his wet sleeves, the seams straining against the sudden tension. His gaze shifted to the figure standing just behind her, Daniel Bryce, the insurance agent. Daniel's tie hung loose around his neck, jacket slung carelessly over one arm. His expression was not one of sympathy, but of smug satisfaction. The look he cast toward Sharon was unmistakable, thick with familiarity that went far beyond business or grief. Michael felt something cold and clean settle over him, slicing through the confusion, the hurt, the disbelief. They hadn't gathered to mourn. They had gathered to cash in. As the organist played a solemn hymn, Michael stepped closer to the doorway, the rain forgotten, his heartbeat slow and deliberate. He was watching his own funeral, not a tribute to a life lost, but a eulogy for the man they had decided to erase. And they didn't even know he was standing right there, in the flesh, ready to tear the mask from every lie spoken in that room. The organ's last mournful note faded into a silence so thick it felt almost sacred. Mourners shifted in their pews, heads bowed, some dabbing at dry eyes with crumpled tissues more out of obligation than sorrow. Sharon moved from the pulpit with measured steps, her heels tapping a hollow rhythm across the wooden floor, the picture of grief softened by something almost victorious gleaming in her eyes. Daniel Bryce stood waiting at the foot of the steps, his hands loose in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to betray the confidence he had no right to feel. Their eyes met, hers and Daniel's, and in that brief exchange, Michael Reed saw everything he needed to see. No fear, no guilt, only the smug, quiet knowledge that their plan had worked. Until the door creaked. It wasn't loud, just a soft, reluctant moan of old hinges. But it was enough. Every head turned. There he stood, framed in the heavy doorway, rain-soaked, hat in one hand, water dripping from his sleeves. Michael's face was pale, sharpened by the storm outside, eyes burning not with rage but with something far more unsettling. Certainty. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, alive, undeniable. For a moment, the room held its breath. Someone gasped. A hymn book slipped from shaking hands and thudded to the floor. Sharon froze mid-step, her lips parted in a soundless half-cry. The color drained from her face so fast it left her looking almost ghostly under the overhead lights. The tissue in her hand fluttered uselessly to the floor. Daniel took a step forward, his body tightening like a spring, instinctively reaching for his inside jacket pocket. But there was no badge there, no protection, only lies stitched into cheap fabric. Michael Reed said nothing. He let the photograph do the speaking for him. Slowly, with the deliberateness of a man carrying the weight of betrayal in his very bones, Michael pulled a single photograph from his jacket pocket and raised it for the room to see. It wasn't the fire that had taken him. It wasn't fate. It was them. The photograph was grainy but unmistakable. Sharon and Daniel, arms entangled, lips pressed together in a cheap motel parking lot 2 towns over. Dated. time-stamped, undeniable. Whispers rippled through the chapel like wind through dry leaves, gathering speed, gaining sharpness. Judging stares turned, not toward Michael, but toward the trembling woman and the man beside her who could no longer meet anyone's gaze. Michael's voice cut through the low murmur like the crack of thunder. Calm, measured. You buried me before the ashes even cooled. And now, it was their turn to be buried alive. The days that followed unfolded with brutal efficiency, like dominoes toppling one after another. Once started, nothing could stop the fall. By Monday morning, whispers had turned into formal complaints. The insurance company launched an immediate investigation, spurred less by conscience than by the sheer scandal brewing in a town too small to contain it. They found the second life insurance policy tucked neatly into Daniel Bryce's private files. A quiet little policy taken out just months before Michael's death, with Sharon as the sole beneficiary. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy. Each charge was a nail hammered into the coffin Sharon and Daniel had built for themselves. Michael never raised his voice, never made threats. He sat silently during every hearing, his presence alone enough to turn once familiar faces away in shame when they caught his gaze. Sharon tried desperately to claw her way out. She blamed Daniel first, painted herself as a woman manipulated, a grieving widow seduced by promises of safety and escape. When that failed, she wept for the court, begged for pity she had never offered him. But lies are like broken glass. The harder you grip them, the deeper they cut. Daniel cracked first. Under pressure, he confessed to everything. The affair, the plan, the staged accident meant to erase Michael without the blood and noise of violence. They had counted on Michael's predictability. His long shifts, his worn truck, his invisible life. They thought no one would look too closely at a simple man from a dead-end town. They were right, until he refused to stay dead. When the judge handed down their sentences, Michael sat alone in the back of the courtroom, the brim of his cap shadowing his face. He didn't smile, he didn't nod. He simply watched as Sharon, once so poised, was led away in handcuffs, her face hollow and pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. Justice didn't come with fireworks or applause. It came in silence, in the slow, heavy closing of a door that would not reopen. Michael didn't stay in Bryan County after that. He sold the house he had built with his own hands. He packed what little mattered into a battered duffel, and he left, not in a blaze of fury, but in quiet, final peace. No obituary needed this time. No mourners. Just a man, alive, carrying only the lessons betrayal had carved into him like stone. And as he drove down the long stretch of highway under the rising sun, Michael Reed smiled for the first time in years, not because he had survived, but because he had chosen to live.